Hey there, it's Carlo from AYCB, and today I'm going to be reviewing Spring Meadow, which is Uwe Rosenberg's final game in his polyomino trilogy. The first two were Cottage Garden and Indian Summer. Whether you've played any of those before, or Patchwork, which is a two-player game he made in the same style, either way there's a lot to like here about Spring Meadow. It's not a perfect game, but there's a lot of interesting stuff that set it apart from some of the other games. Let me tell you a bit more about it. The first thing you'll notice in terms of the presentation of the game is it's not quite as colorful as Cottage Garden or especially Indian Summer, which is, I would say, arguably the nicest looking one of the trilogy. It has a little more of a simple, subtle look to the artwork, but I think it fits the game well. You know, the theme involves the snow melting away as winter ends and spring begins, so obviously there's a lot of white just from the snow. As you're filling your boards with tiles, it kind of heralds the arrival of spring, so you're kind of adding more color to it. But overall, you look at the components, they all fit the game super well. It's nothing spectacular. You're not going to be, showing off the components to your friends. It might not be one of the absolute nicest games in your collection, but I don't really have anything negative to say about the artwork. The little marmots are pretty nice looking. The signpost is a neat little thing. The compass kind of works, not only well as a placeholder, but like just the theme of a compass works well when you're kind of finding your way on a hike, I suppose. The Edelweiss hiking pins, the rocks, everything kind of fits together well. Going back to theme for a moment though, if you're the type of person who really needs a strong thematic presence in your games, this might not be the game for you. I gotta be honest, while I'm playing, I can't say I've ever really thought about hiking or applied anything relating to hiking to the game. The theme is really just more of a backdrop to the game. It's kind of similar to Cottage Garden and Indian Summer in that way, but I maybe felt like the theme was integrated a little more, especially in Cottage Garden, but even in Indian Summer as well. Here it's definitely kind of just a loose thing. Again, doesn't really take away from the game if you don't mind that. I don't personally come to Spring Meadow for the theme, and the sort of lack of cohesion between the theme and the gameplay hasn't really affected my enjoyment of it at all. So what you're probably wondering is the game design different enough from Cottage Garden and Indian Summer to warrant, playing another one of these games or owning Spring Meadow as well? I would say the answer is yes. There's a lot different in this game that sets it apart from the other ones while sharing some of those familiar mechanics. For starters, I really like the 5x5 board, the central board, the grid here. I like how as the signpost goes around, you might be taking something from a row or column here, and that might have been a tile that someone else could have taken as the signpost swung around the other side later. So that kind of makes there's potentially a little bit of player interaction in that sense. Another thing would be the marmots and the burrows on the boards. The fact that everyone has their own personal board, and you're trying to kind of build around these burrows, but you've got the holes in the tiles that again, you can use the holes over the burrows themselves to clear them, but the fact that you can, you also you can only cover a burrow with a part of the tile that doesn't have a hole if you already have a cleared burrow. It's a nice little restriction that makes you have to work around it, but it also rewards you for playing around it properly, because if you're clearing those burrows and lining up your holes properly, there's opportunities for a lot of extra points. So I really like that aspect. The fact that your points at the end of the game don't really matter, like you're scoring throughout, so you get 1 point for winning the round, right? Your points don't matter at the end of the game so much as they do at the timing of the scoring rounds. I really like that. I like the fact that you can kind of see in advance when a scoring round may or may not be happening. Sometimes you're taking a tile that you don't want as much, but it might lead to scoring happening sooner or later. So if you feel like you've got a really good lead on the other players, you might want to do something that you think will speed up the scoring round. Whereas if you feel like you're falling behind, you might take a different tile that makes it, delay the scoring for a few more rounds. I really like that. Another thing I really like about this is the strategy of lining up those tiles with holes to get those rocks. So again, because everything on the board, I think the smallest piece here covers 2 spaces and it has 2 holes. The biggest ones, like these ones that have 6 spaces, don't tend to have holes. So it's like the more coverage you're getting from the bigger space, you're not getting those the holes that allow you to combo and get the rocks. But if you're taking those smaller pieces, or even the bigger ones, and you're just doing a great job lining up all those holes, long term, I find most often the player who wins the game is the player who had the most extra coverage from these rock tiles. I always say at the end of the game, when we determine who the winner is, I always ask everyone, take your the main tiles, put them back in the box, but set aside your rocks just so you can compare and see who had how many rocks. It's not an indication that that person's always going to win, but it definitely makes a big difference in getting that extra coverage each turn. It's also worth noting that although the game does have a certain element of luck, in terms of, if you land on a row or column where none of the tiles there work for you in any particular way, you could feel like it's unlucky, but for the most part, if you're not doing well, or if you come up short, you can usually look back and realize, oh, I should have done this differently, or I should have put this in a different spot. So I like that there's a certain element of luck. So, if you play with the same player, it's not like there's, the better player is going to win 100 out of 100 times sort of thing. But I like that little, slight infusion of luck, but for the most part, it's about your long-term planning and how you carry out that planning and the decisions you make throughout the game. Another thing I really like about the design is the solo mode. I have to say, most games I play where there's a solo mode, sometimes it can feel like it might be just tacked on, or even though it might be alright, you might think, I'm never going to pull that game off the shelf specifically to play the solo mode. The solo mode in Spring Meadow not only is quite different from the regular game in the way it plays, but it's also really challenging, but also really rewarding. But there's a target score in the rules that says, if you get this many points, you had a good game, you can aim for this many points. So in the solo mode, it actually keeps track of your points using a different system on the other side of the board. And then there's even a campaign mode where it suggests basically playing 4 games in a row, where you use a different set of 25 tiles each game, and then you're adding up your score to see if you can beat a target of, I believe it's 600 points on their campaign. So I tried it a bunch of times. It took me a while to even get their target good score, what they say in the rules. It was probably my 10th attempt or so at the solo game. I tried the campaign mode once or twice. I was not able to reach the 600 points. I had a blast playing it each time I did. So even though I prefer playing the game with 2, 3, or 4 players, it's definitely one that I'll get back to the table in solo mode just because I got to get that campaign score. So I mentioned before that there can be a little bit of player interaction when you might take a tile that is also in a row or column that someone else would be able to take from later. So that tends to come up every once in a while, but there isn't really a whole lot of take that. You can't really do things intentionally to hamper your opponents and that sort of thing. So the player interaction overall is pretty low. To be honest, this is one of those games that even at a 4-player count, you could technically play the entire game start to finish in complete silence without saying a single word, because you just take a tile, place it, move the signpost, as long as everyone knows it's their turn. Technically, communication doesn't have to even come into play with this. So if you're someone who really relies on high player interaction to have fun in your games, this probably isn't the one for you. To be honest, even though I had a lot of fun playing this, and I still do, I don't know if I'd use the word fun to describe the game. Think of the way you do I know we're using puzzle tiles, but think of actually doing a puzzle. You're putting towards you're using your spatial awareness. It's kind of a relaxing thing though, and that's kind of what I think of Spring Meadow as. It's a pretty laid back, relaxing game. You're not going to feel really stressed out about your decisions. Even if it's your turn, you're not like, oh, everyone's watching me, what am I going to do here, sort of thing. It tends to be a pretty relaxed experience. At the same time, there can be a decent amount of strategy, so it kind of depends on who you're playing with. If you're playing with someone else who's just kind of wants that lazy Sunday afternoon game, you can just play it while you're talking and going back and forth, and it could just be kind of a relaxing gaming experience. Whereas if you're playing with people who might prefer, high strategy games and that sort of thing, there is room for a lot of strategy in here. And it kind of depends on who you're playing with in terms of, how serious people get, how much you're thinking about your long-term strategy versus kind of just placing these tiles and trying to fit them around. So I think there's a good variety in that sense in terms of, you can take it really seriously and be competitive, or you can also just play with your significant other and you're kind of just both taking it easy, enjoying a relaxing game. Part of what really makes me enjoy the game, though, is its short playtime. Honestly, playing with 2 players, I don't know if I've ever had a game take longer than half an hour. Sometimes that can include setup. 20-25 minutes is not abnormal for this game for a 2-player game. Even playing with 4, I think I've maybe once had a game go over an hour, and that was a particularly, slow game. But because it's so quick to teach, like you can teach this to anyone, it's super easy to learn, can make for a good gateway game, so you can get it to the table kind of anytime. And because of how quickly the turns move, even though I said the player interaction is really low, you never really tend to get bored when it's not your turn, because you can already look ahead at, my next turn I already know what column or row I'm going to be picking from, so you can already start strategizing, looking ahead, especially if there's only 1 or 2 tiles on that row, and you're also interested in what other players are doing, because you kind of, you don't have to, but it definitely helps to have an idea of how well other players are doing to see if you think they want to or don't want to trigger the scoring round, or if you want to have an idea of whether you're going to be in the lead or not. And with, I think, maybe not all, but most great games, you have that feeling at the end of, I want to try again because I know I can do better, right? So there's a bit of that addictive quality because it's such a quick game to get going again. You always think, I just want to try again, and maybe I'll prioritize, lining up a bigger chain of holes early to get more of those rock pieces for coverage, or maybe you're going to try a different strategy where, you're just kind of racing to get the highest score each scoring round without thinking about the long-term holes, right? So, it's got that quality where you just want to keep coming back and playing it. If you like these style of games, this is definitely one worth owning. I've probably played it about 20 times so far. I haven't gotten tired of it yet. It's still a blast every time I play it. I have to say, as I mentioned before, the solo mode is quite good and really adds to the replay value if you're into the solo mode, because not only is it different and interesting, it's really challenging, so I found it helped me improve a lot at the game, but it also just, because you can do the campaign mode and there's target scores to get and you can always best your old high score, that definitely adds to some of the value. The fact that it works as on multiple levels too, like, you can use this really as a gateway game. I've taught this game to people who don't really play many games or haven't played many games. No one has found it overwhelming, and across all my gaming groups, whether it's someone who has very little experience with games or has only played like little card games, to my friends who enjoy the most kind of heavier, longer, complex strategy games, everyone is always surprised by how much they like this game. And I think it's because when you see it on the shelf, first off, the name Spring Meadow, and then it's not the most colorful game. I don't see this on a shelf and think, ooh, what's this Spring Meadow about, right? But I think it still definitely deserves a place in many collections, just based on how often you'll get it to the table, the variety of player counts. I have to mention truly that this is one game where I wouldn't specifically recommend it to people at a specific player count. There's a lot of other games where I'd say, it plays up to 4, but you really want to just play with 2 or 3, or the 4-player version's best, it's not as good. Honestly, Spring Meadow is, I would say, equally good whether you have 2, 3, or 4 players. And again, the solo mode's awesome too, so that adds a lot to it. Although I can't really say which you'll like more between Spring Meadow, Indian Summer, and Cottage Garden, it's important to note that this is the one where the player turns probably move the quickest. It's probably the easiest to teach people, and has probably the best replayability across all player counts of any of the 3 in the trilogy. Overall, I'd say the best thing about this game is the same case with a lot of Uwe Rosenberg games, where it's got a surprising amount of strategy for a relatively simple rule set. It's one of those games that's super easy to learn, but very difficult to master, and that's what will keep you coming back to play it again and again. Hope you enjoyed watching this. If you wanted to see any more of our thoughts about Spring Meadow or any other games, check out our YouTube channel or visit allyoucanboard.com. Thanks for watching.